Attention, this video contains my opinions, thus, some of my points are from my personal feelings or experiences. If you can't stand that kind of stuff, you probably shouldn't be watching this video. You know, I must have been feeling really suicidal to make a video like this. The Legend of Zelda's reception is easily one of the biggest mixed bags to date. While some hail it as the granddaddy to open-world games, others call it one of the most frustrating games to date. Whether you hate it or love it, The Legend of Zelda revolutionized gaming in a way we had never seen before. For once, we had a game that gave us true freedom, to do whatever or go wherever first. There were little to no limits, you could just do whatever. However, after the franchise had exploded with the public, things changed. Move on to Zelda 2 and... wait, where's my total freedom? What happened to the times where we could go anywhere? The times where we wandered around in Hyrule, not knowing what to expect? For all of you that don't know, Zelda 2 is not like the first entry in the slightest. It's a side-scroller featuring EXP, an overworld that is strictly made for going to location, and all enemy encounters were taken to a different screen now. We have a game where the objectives are more clear, a game where, instead of strictly focusing on exploration, we have NPC interactions, heavily changed combat, and a crouching feature. And this is where the whole "not a true Zelda game" phrase started popping up. What people had wanted in Zelda 2 was more dungeons, more items, and an even more open world to explore. But the sequel is not just Zelda 1 but better, and people got really upset and threw a huge fit over it. This situation got even worse when Ocarina of Time showed up on the scene. Ocarina of Time returned back to the open world formula, but with a different approach. Rather than being like the original and giving you pure freedom from the start, Ocarina of Time is set up where you have to go through the first 3 dungeons before you could fully explore the world. Let me just say, I've never seen a 3 dungeon process make people so quick to judge. And even though Ocarina of Time is my second favorite Zelda game, I have to be completely honest here and say that this game utterly broke the fanbase. Not only now was this game not fully open world, but it's slower. By the way, this slower argument is rather weak. You have to think of the time. The Zelda franchise before was a game where you sort of, emphasis on sort of, mindlessly attacked enemies. When Ocarina of Time was in development, the developers would of course have to look back at this and think, how would a real swordsman handle battles? Thus, the Z-targeting was born. Innovation, baby! But back on topic here, this is where the problem just started expanding. Everybody who swore by the holy book of Zelda 1's manual just sat there, waiting for another fully open world game to happen. To them, every future title was not a true Zelda game because it didn't just go, here's a sword, now go figure everything else out. And to this, I must strongly disagree. Given just how expansive the franchise has grown, it's more than clear that the Zelda franchise was in a highly experimental era. Just take the original trilogy for example. None of these games feel like each other in the slightest. It's more than clear that Nintendo, or more specifically Miyamoto, wanted to try and see what sat well the most with the fans. One game was a completely open world game, one was a 2D side-scroller, and the other is a refined version of the first title that favors a greater focus on purpose of story and reason as opposed to openness. So it's pretty clear that the franchise was trying to figure out where it best fit, and A Link to the Past is what clearly got everybody's attention. And while the previously mentioned Ocarina of Time is an open world game, it starts off with a linear 3 dungeon process so you can unlock your true potential to better prepare yourself for the journey that lies ahead. Other future titles have you gathering magical items or gathering allies so you can ready yourself for greater threats. You see, this, to me at least, is one thing I love about the future titles, even Zelda 2. You feel like you're doing everything with a purpose. Now, this is not to say that every moment of the first title feels pointless. I mean, if you stay on the title screen long enough or even bother to read the manual, you definitely have a little bit of this. And there are other few moments where it feels like you're actually progressing through the game. Situations such as using the raft to cross a body of water, using the flute to drain the pond to access level 7, or entering the final dungeon felt like I was actually getting somewhere. Even with games like Earthbound Beginnings, a really open yet cryptic game, I still felt like I was actually doing something the entire time. And it's really funny to me how demanding the Zelda fanbase is of their games. There's plenty of examples of games that got sequels nothing like the previous. Duke Nukem 3D is absolutely nothing like its previous games, but everybody loved it. Super Paper Mario, while not completely different, was very different from the two previous games, but everybody loved it. Now, I can understand why people may consider a game not a true sequel if that said sequel completely abandons what made everybody love the first or previous games, but the thing is, Zelda games never completely abandoned the formula. Even the Lone Wolf Zelda 2, a game you really can't compare to other titles, has a big focus on exploring the world. Each game has side quests, secret heart containers / pieces, secret collectibles, etc. It seems that, because The Legend of Zelda did something innovative, a sequel absolutely must have a completely open world aspect to be considered a true Zelda game. But you know what other game was innovative of its time? Super Mario Bros. For the NES. A game that has solidified the side-scroller genre has had countless games that don't feel like the classic formula, pretty much only keeping the jump on enemies gig and the level progression. And while they really never mention it, it's more than clear that these drastically different games are related to each other, although the Paper Mario series is in an alternate universe. So essentially, Zelda 1 sits on a high throne not because of its innovation, but because other titles didn't do exactly what it did. But back to the future titles. It's not like the franchise just completely abandoned open world gameplay. Zelda 2 and every title after has a new structure where there is now a main story to follow as well as giving the rest of the world to explore. No matter how content-packed or lackluster a Zelda game was, every title followed this. I mean, let's get real here. For anybody out there who has actually played the Oracle games, you can't tell me that there's not a ton of secrets to find and that there's not a ton of side quests. Granted, while the side quests in those games were mostly carbon copy, mostly just the passcodes you had to exchange between titles, I couldn't help but feel accomplished finding those secrets in those games. Or how about another example? The Minish Cap. Its open world mechanic was centered more around you. You gather the Kinstone pieces, exchange them with NPCs, and the secrets on the overworld are unlocked. I could go on with more examples, but we'd be here for days. As for the dungeon sequences going from non-linear to linear, I can't really say that it bothers me. I mean, heck, in the first Zelda game, going in the dungeons out of order isn't even the best option, as you're likely to either get stuck or wrecked, minus a few exceptions. But the point I'm getting to is that the series as a whole felt more organized after Zelda 1. With a larger focus on linearity, the series felt like it had more weight to it. Being given clear objectives isn't always a matter of hand-holding. Yes, games like Skyward Sword were a bit more comfortable giving you specific directions, but it never felt too linear, as some say. You were still given the option to go out and explore, and while most of the secrets were now goddess cubes, a secret is still a secret, regardless of how it appears. As for item upgrades, rather than making it available through some random cave or side quest, you actually had to go out into the world and find materials to make them. Skyward Sword offered a new way to explore the world, and I think that it deviating away from the typical formula was a brave yet innovative step. Now, am I saying that every Zelda game should follow Skyward Sword's idea of an open world? No. Now, I'm not brushing the first title aside. After all, it is the open world novelty of it that shaped future titles into what they are today. However, it's a novelty of its time, and Nintendo later found a comfort zone with how they wanted to handle it. It seems that the new Breath of the Wild is just a cave-in to the fan base's cry for another open game. I mean, Eiji Aonuma himself couldn't even beat the first game because of its serious lack of directions, and he's going out of his way to make another game like it? It doesn't help that in this day and age, linearity is starting to be treated like a craft from the devil himself. I mean, Nintendo didn't even consider making a fully open-world Zelda game until more recently when the bandwagon started becoming more vocal in 2013. Ironically, the same year that Breath of the Wild was announced and A Link Between Worlds showed up. Heck, I didn't even notice a bunch of people complaining until more recently about not having more open Zelda games. However, Breath of the Wild is not even released yet, and even then, Monolith Soft, the people behind the Xenoblade Chronicles series, is helping out with this game, so the game might have some kind of weight to it. As I think that if Nintendo just soloed this, it'd be another A Link Between Worlds, a throwback to basically everything you already knew without really improving upon it. A Link Between Worlds was a good game, but it was really messy. The game had to sacrifice a lot of what we know about Zelda games to become truly open. There's no such thing as difficulty scaling in that game. No matter how far you got, every place stayed about as equally difficult. Even the first game had difficulty scaling. Also, it kind of tried to give you a more open feeling by making items purchasable rather than hidden in dungeons, and I don't even need to describe what's wrong there. And I'm still worried, as in Breath of the Wild, you can literally run to the end of the game right from the get-go. I'm sorry, I am still going to be playing a Zelda game, right? That doesn't even sound good like some people are saying. By this point in the series, this is starting to sound like a sloppy entry. Even the first game had boundaries. This is just way too much freedom. This is Zelda, not the Elder Scrolls. So is this what we really want? A future of callback games blowing the open world aspect out of the water? A future of games where there's not going to be any difficulty scaling? A future of games just as, if not more confusing than Zelda 1? And please don't think that kids like me are just too lazy these days to figure out Zelda 1. My own mother, who was pretty much an 80s kid, hated the first game because of just how confusing it got at times. And just take a wild guess as to what her favorite franchise is. So, yeah. The huge openness of the first title is both its greatest strength, yet its greatest weakness. I don't want to use this as a generalization that a lot of people hated this, but my mom can't be the only one who had these negative views. I'll even be honest myself and say that when I first played Zelda 1 when I was 2, the non-linearity didn't bother me, but back then, like any other average kid around that age, basically everything amused you. With this said, I feel that the praise of the lack of directions is more or less held up by nostalgia, as when I went back to play the game, years later, I found myself getting really annoyed most of the time. I used to consider Majora's Mask the best Zelda game ever when I was 6, but as I became older and learned to take off the nostalgia goggles, I realized that there were other Zelda games I preferred to play to that game, because when I went back to play it, it wasn't as fun as I last remembered it. I'm not calling it a bad game, it's actually really good. My views just changed. So long story short, pushing the open world aspect of the first game aside a little bit so the franchise could focus more on story and accessibility is what made it shine to me. If this really does disappoint you, then I'm sorry that taking the best way for people of all ages to enjoy the series bothers you. For all of you out there that sat through my rant, thanks. It's good to know that people out there are interested in hearing what I have to say. So as always, I thank you all for watching. I'm RoberOnocle, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.